Okay, well, good morning. My name is Haroro Ingram. I'm a senior research fellow with the program on extremism at George Washington University, and I'll be chairing today's event, organised in conjunction with the Congressional Counter-Terrorism Caucus, Domestic Terrorism and Legal Perspectives on Terrorist Content Online. Now, we have a really exceptional lineup of speakers today, all of whom have recently published policy papers released by the program on extremism, and again in partnership with the Congressional Counter-Terrorism Caucus. So let me just take a moment to introduce the speakers and bring your attention to their recent publications. First, we have Professor Mary McCord, Senior Litigator from practice at the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection, Visiting Professor of Law at Georgetown University's Law Center, and the former Acting Assistant Attorney General for National Security at the US Department of Justice. And we were very fortunate to have Mary write Filling the Gap in Our Terrorism Statutes, where she argues for attaching specific criminal statutes to domestic terrorism offences and outlines its implications for confronting the domestic terrorism threat in the United States. We then have Dr. Mark Pitkavich, Senior Research Fellow with the Anti-Defamation League and former Research Director for the Justice Department's State and Local Anti-Terrorism Training Program. Now, you would all be aware of Mark's publications on domestic terrorism and right-wing extremism in the United States. Less known, perhaps, at least publicly, is the important work that Mark has done training law enforcement officials. His recent publication for the program, Surveying the Landscape of the American Far Right, paints a really, frankly, disturbing, but also a complex picture of this surging threat in the homeland. And closing today is Alexander Gittard, who leads global partnership building for MNC Saatchi. Very much a scholar practitioner. Alex began his career as a US Army officer before serving as a US Foreign Services officer. He's a fellow at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue and a Society Advisory Group board member for the British Council. Sorry, I want to make sure that here is Alex's recent publication, Counterterrorism is a Public Function, Resetting the Balance Between Public and Private Sectors in Preventing Terrorist Use of the Internet. Now, all of these publications can be found on the Program on Extremism website, and we also have some samples at the back as well. Just quickly, the format for today is that each speaker will present for 10 to 15 minutes, and after a short discussion between the panelists, we then intend to open up to the audience and leave plenty of time for questions. So, to open today's panel, thank you, Mary.
Sure. Well, thanks to everyone for being here. I know there's been a lot of conversation about this topic recently, but really over the last couple of years. As was just mentioned, I had been the Acting Assistant Attorney General for National Security through May of 2017. I was over the National Security Division from 2014 to 2017, so was there to live through ISIS declaring a caliphate and the most urgent pace of counterterrorism investigations and operations that the FBI and DOJ had seen domestically since 9/11. And so what then we moved toward by the time we were getting 2016 into 2017 and beyond is seeing a similar sort of pace in terms of the threat to the United States, the lethality of terrorism in the United States from what has been commonly thought of as domestic extremist causes, which are ideologically based extremism that turns violent but not based on the ideology of a foreign terrorist organization like Al-Qaeda or like ISIS, but instead based on things like white supremacy. And I mentioned that because there are lots of ideologies that people can be extreme about, but the one that is posing the biggest threat to actually human life here in the homeland, and this has been corroborated by FBI Director Wray and Assistant Director Mike McGarity, is the threat from far-right white supremacist and white nationalist violence. I even saw it when I was at the Department of Justice that until the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando, which was an act of in furtherance of ISIS, the number of deaths from domestic, what we think of as domestic terrorism, were greater than number of deaths in the U.S. from international terrorism. Pulse nightclub rejiggered that temporarily, but now it's back to, again, the numbers being higher from domestic domestic terrorist causes than international terrorism causes. So I first started really writing. We thought a lot about this when I was at DOJ, whether there was a gap that needed to be filled in our statutes. There's so much confusion every time there's a terrorist attack in the U.S. There's confusion about, is it domestic terrorism? There's been historically a reluctance for our government to call things terrorism if they haven't been related to a foreign terrorist organization. Partly that's because there hasn't been a statute that directly relates to most acts of domestic terrorism, which are mass shootings, and in some cases acts committed with vehicles. And so there's also a reluctance on the part of prosecutors and the government to call someone a domestic terrorist when they're not going to be able to be charged with a crime of terrorism. They have an automatic way to go into court and say, I can't get a fair trial. I was called a terrorist, and I'm not charged with a terrorist crime. So there's a lot of historic reasons, I think, for the reluctance of the U.S. government to call things domestic terrorism that by all measures, including the measure of the definition in the U.S. Code of domestic terrorism, by all these measures, these things would clearly qualify as domestic terrorism. That's changing. We saw it when Jeff Sessions called James Fields, who ran his car into a group of counter-protesters after the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in August 2017. We saw Jeff Sessions call him a domestic terrorist. We saw recently U.S. Attorney John Bash, after El Paso, call the shooter there a domestic terrorist, and in the next breath say, so we're looking at hate crimes. And the reason he had to say that is because there was no terrorism crime that applied. And so, as I mentioned, I first started writing about this 2 days after the Unite the Right rally, when it had occurred to me, because just coming out of the government and having seen the increasing use of vehicles as a weapon in terrorist attacks across Europe, Southeast Asia, other areas of the world, we were seeing it here in the U.S., and we had seen it in some cases on behalf of foreign terrorist organizations, but here it was a white nationalist using his vehicle to commit a terrorist attack. And the lack of moral equivalency between these things really struck me the day after Charlottesville. This is a person who had an ideology, an extremist ideology. He was certainly trying to intimidate and coerce a civilian population, influence the policy of government through intimidation and coercion. That's the definition of terrorism. Yet, of course, he wasn't charged with a crime of terrorism. He was charged under state law with murder, sentenced to multiple life terms. He was, because he also injured dozens of people, seriously injured, and he was ultimately charged with federal hate crimes, sentenced to life terms under those hate crime statutes as well. So it wasn't a lack of criminal statutes that would apply to his conduct, just like with the shooter in Pittsburgh at the Tree of Life Synagogue, just with Dylan Roof years ago, and just with the El Paso shooter. It's not that there are no criminal statutes that apply. Murder is a crime in all 50 states, punishable by at least life imprisonment, in many cases the death penalty. Assault with a dangerous weapon, aggravated assault, these are crimes in all 50 states. But state law crimes are about the reason they're prosecuted locally is because they're state law offenses, right? They're about the ability of the state to protect its people by criminalizing behavior that occurs within its jurisdiction. Terrorism is a very different thing. Terrorism is not limited to the state. Its very intent is to have an impact well beyond the people engaged in the crime and the victim of the crime. It's an intent to intimidate and coerce beyond the city level, beyond the state level, beyond even the national level, and that's why we call it terrorism. So, I began to think more about what are the gaps and how do we fill them, and what roles would that play? And there is the moral equivalency, which I don't think can be discounted. People will sometimes say to me, is that all it really is? It's just semantics that, you want to be able to officially call things terrorism. Well, I don't think that's not all it is, but I also don't think we should downplay that, because education of the American public is an important piece of our entire criminal statutory regime at the federal level, and certainly an important piece of our national counter-terrorism program. And for too long, particularly post 9/11, I think for people in the U.S., they hear the word terrorist, and what do they automatically think? They think Islamist, extremist terrorists. They think Al-Qaeda. They think ISIS. They think Muslim Americans or Muslims who have immigrated here. They don't think that terrorism can go beyond that. So when you see that, as I started out, that the lethality from domestic terrorist acts is greater than the lethality here in the homeland, is greater than the lethality from international extremism, we need to do some education. And people need to understand that anyone who is using violence as a mean to get their extremist ideology out to intimidate or coerce, that's terrorism, whether it's motivated by Islamist extremism, far right-wing extremism, animal rights extremism, anarchist extremism. It doesn't matter. Using violence to intimidate and coerce is terrorism. So there's an educational component because we use our federal criminal statutes to show society's condemnation for criminal activity in this country. So it sends that message that this is condemned by society regardless of what is motivating, regardless of the ideology. I think that's important. But it's also important because with a statute, if we were to create a statute, which I've advocated for in this paper, come resources. I mean, let's just be honest. If Congress says, here's a statute, they expect the FBI and law enforcement to actually use that statute and use it to try to prevent terrorist attacks, because we're talking about terrorism. And so the gap here is that the counterterrorism regime, particularly post 9/11, was built on this notion of prevention, not merely responding after the fact and bringing justice to victims. And in fact, recently, when Mike McGarity, who's the assistant director for counterterrorism at the Bureau, testified along with Calvin Shivers, who's I think the deputy assistant secretary in the Civil Rights Division of the FBI, where they investigate hate crimes, they explain sort of the difference in these regimes. The counterterrorism regime is based on prevention. Hate crimes is built on bringing justice to victims. Now, that doesn't mean that couldn't change, but historically, that's how the investigators have approached their mission. That's how the prosecutors have approached their mission. And that means in the counterterrorism side of things, they use aggressive law enforcement tools, some of which are controversial, some of which people think have been used too aggressively, but tools like undercover personas going online to engage with would-be jihadists, would-be right-wing extremists, would-be those who are seeking to use violence as a mean to intimidate and coerce. They run sting operations to take down terrorist planning before it actually becomes a terrorist attack. And like I said, these things can be controversial. Certainly there's been a lot of controversy over their use with respect to foreign terrorist organization-inspired violence, but these are the same tools that the FBI uses to prevent child sexual exploitation. I tried those cases for several years and supervised the trial of those cases. They have undercover FBI agents pose as pedophiles, get in pedophile chat rooms, set up sting operations. They take the case down when the guy's knocking on the door of a hotel room. He thinks he's going to have sex with a 7-year-old, but there is no 7-year-old. What they've done is just prevented sex with a real 7-year-old. It's the same regime. We can criticize it, but that's what law enforcement use. It's been upheld by the courts, and it is how you prevent things. And that's just a difference in modality, a difference in approach that resources would flow to if you have this kind of crime. Can the FBI do it right now? A lot of civil rights and civil liberties folks will say to me, they could just more aggressively investigate hate crimes. And it's true, they could. Just the way, I'm just a pragmatist, and I've worked with the FBI for over 2 decades, almost 3 decades, and I just know how things work. And what I'm trying to do is be very pragmatic about what's most likely to actually be effective in our system. And I was glad to see that the CT squad has now got a joint task force with the hate crime squad at the Bureau, so that they're doing more sharing of information, because hopefully that will help to address this threat. There's also is a very specific gap that I want to talk about, because people often say, is there actually any gap? And there is, and it was illustrated very clearly this past year with the case of Christopher Paul Hassan. So Christopher Paul Hassan was the lieutenant in the Coast Guard who was stockpiling assault rifles and other weapons intending to commit a mass attack in order to create an ethno-state. And happily, he was thwarted in these plans because I think he was using his government computer to do some of his writing about this, and that's a big no-no, but thankfully he was foolish enough to do it on his government computer, and that allowed for law enforcement to be able to get a search warrant and learn about this mass arsenal of weapons that he had acquired. So because He was not doing this in furtherance of any sort of foreign terrorist organization, and because there is no crime of terrorism that applies to terrorist acts committed using firearms, the only thing he was able to be charged with was unlawful possession of a silencer, unlawful possession of drugs, because he happened to have drugs, and unlawful possession of a firearm by a drug addict, because he had drugs with his weapons. These are all 5-year offenses. They are not violent crimes, and the magistrate judge actually said he was going to have to release Mr. Hassan pre-trial, not detain him pre-trial, despite all the evidence of what his intent was, because none of these were even violent crimes. Now, happily, the government appealed that to the district court judge, who agreed to detain Mr. Hassan, but it really tied law enforcement hands. Here we have a person dedicated. He had a 4-year plan, I believe, and he had all the weapons he was going to acquire year to year as he made his plans before he launched his attack. And we had a judge who was ready to let this guy go, because he's like, all you're charging him with are these piddly possessory offenses. So to back up just a moment, and I'm mindful of the clock, many people say there are 51 terrorism offenses. We don't need a new terrorism offense. So of those 51, there is not a single one of them that applies to the most common terrorist attack, whether it's a FTO-based terrorist attack, white supremacist terrorist attack. The most common here in the U.S. is the mass shooting, right? Not one of those offenses applies when you're committing that crime of mass shooting using a firearm unless your target is a U.S. government official. Then that qualifies as a crime of terrorism, right? So, for example, if the El Paso shooter had declared bayat to al-Baghdadi before he committed his mass shooting, I guarantee you he would be facing right now multiple terrorism crimes. But because instead he was doing this in order to create a white ethno-state, there is no terrorism crime that applies. In addition, that also means the sort of preparatory steps, the stockpiling of weapons to commit a terrorist attack, also doesn't have a terrorism crime associated with it. So if you created a crime, if Congress passed a statute that criminalized already pre-existing crimes of violence with the requisite intent, so we're talking about, based generally off of 18 U.S.C. 2332 little b, which is acts of terrorism transcending national boundaries. Based basically off of that, it could criminalize existing crimes of violence, so murder, kidnapping, ADW, aggravated assault, and the acts of terrorism transcending national boundaries also criminalizes destruction of property where, not just destruction of property, but where there's a substantial risk of death or serious bodily injury, right? So you criminalize that when done with the intent to intimidate or coerce a civilian population or influence the policy of government through intimidation or coercion, which are the existing definitions of terrorism. That would be this new crime. It wouldn't be domestic terrorism, except that it's terrorism occurring domestically. In other words, it would be ideologically neutral. Any crime like that that occurs in the territorial U.S. would qualify, including those done on behalf of ISIS or Al-Qaeda or a foreign terrorist organization, those done on behalf of white nationalist causes, those done on behalf of anarchist or sovereign citizen causes. Anything done in the continental U.S. with those purposes would be that crime. What you would then could do is amend a statute that's wrongly called material support to terrorists, not to be confused with material support to a foreign terrorist organization, because we are not talking here about designating domestic organizations as terrorist organizations. Not at all. First Amendment challenges would be prohibitive in that regard. But putting that aside, the statute is 18 U.S.C. 2339, capital A, material support to terrorists, which is not really named correctly, as I said. But what it does is it prohibits the providing of material support or resources or concealing or disguising the nature or location of resources. So think AR-15s, right, weapons, firearms, knowing and intending that they are to be used in the commission of any one of this long list of terrorism crimes, right? So if we had a new terrorism crime that was added to that list, this crime of terrorism occurring in the jurisdiction of the territorial U.S., then you get the stockpile, right? Then you get the person who is disguising and concealing the nature and location of resources, AR-15, other weapons, knowing and intending they're going to be used to commit this act of terrorism in the U.S. We saw after El Paso, the FBI really went hard trying to do search warrants and go after people stockpiling weapons. But in none of these cases, unless there was a tie to an FTO or unless there was a weapon of mass destruction used, in none of these cases were they able to really charge terrorism offenses. Just two quick things I'll say. I understand, and I've met with many of the civil rights and civil liberties groups, and I understand the strong reluctance to give, frankly, the Bureau any additional authorities. There is a history in this country of abuse by our law enforcement of the authorities they have, particularly with respect to vulnerable populations and people of color. And there is such distrust right now among those communities with our law enforcement operations that in many cases they would frankly rather preserve the status quo than give any additional authority to the Bureau. Importantly, a statute isn't an additional authority. It's not a way to do new intelligence collection or do more sting operations, because those already exist, but there's not been, it does give them something to be aiming toward. The Bureau, like all law enforcement, is thinking, unless you're in counterintelligence, put that aside, is thinking all the time about what crime are we investigating? What are we driving toward? And when you have that crime that applies so directly to the things they're trying to ferret out, that allows them the predicate to use the tools that already exist, not new tools, but the predicate to use those to more readily open domestic terrorism investigations to try to ferret out this activity. And in order to guard, I'm open and want to hear advice and suggestions about how to prevent abuses. The most obvious to me are annual public reporting to Congress of the number of investigations opened. Did they become cases? What were the charges? Were they closed? By what category? White racially motivated violence, other racially motivated violence, animal extremism, anarchy, Islamist extremism, whatever the category. Not getting into the business of every case, but whatever the category. And then the whole American public and Congress can see, Bureau, are you using your resources commensurate with the threat, or are you throwing all your resources at animal extremism when we haven't seen a death from that in the U.S. in years? Very public reporting, very open for people to comment on. The second thing I've suggested, and this is in Congressman Schiff's bill, is that the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, PCLOB, review after, I think he put 4 years, that's not a magic number, whatever number of years would allow them to have enough information to actually do a review, maybe it's 2 years, that they can review. How is the FBI using this? Are they using it to put their resources to the place that prevents the greatest threat, or are they misusing it? And the PCLOB has been very good in the last several years at making transparent government programs, primarily surveillance programs, but really educating the American population about what our government's doing with its surveillance programs, criticizing where they needed to criticize, praising where they needed to praise, and suggesting reforms where that was needed. And so I think that's another way we might be able to get at, hopefully, some of the fears of misuse that would allow us for a system that will provide better data collection, better resources, and hopefully a real prevention strategy to go after the current threat. And I'm sorry if I over-spoke.
Thanks to everybody who showed up here. Thanks also to George Washington University's program on extremism and the Congressional Counter-Terrorism Caucus for giving me the opportunity to talk to you this morning. Thanks also to my fellow panelists who are great minds with great ideas. I'm here because of a paper I wrote for the program on extremism, Surveying the Landscape of the American Far Right. And I think it's important for us to understand the extreme right in the United States because so much violence and crime has come from this quarter, yet it's so often underappreciated. And in fact, this is a topic that in the past 2-3 years has gotten a lot more media attention. But the fact is that when it comes to domestic extremism and domestic terrorism as opposed to either Islamist extremist violence or international terrorism, it gets a lot less, historically it gets a lot less coverage in the media. A lot of domestic terror incidents actually get reported only locally or regionally. They never make the national news. In part, this is because many of these incidents take place far away from major media centers. And so some of these attacks are planned not in New York City or Washington, D.C. or Chicago, but in Garden City, Kansas, or in Sallisaw, Oklahoma, or in some other more remote area. To give you a sense of what I mean, and here's what I'd kind of like to do in the time that I have for you. I'd like to spend a little bit of time sort of explaining why it's important to understand the nature of the extreme right in the United States. I'm going to throw some numbers at you. And then I want to give you a whirlwind tour of the fastest tour of the extreme right in the United States you will ever see. But before I get into either of those, I want to take a moment to introduce a colleague of mine who's in the room, Michael Lieberman, who's our Washington counsel and the director of our Civil Rights Policy Planning Center, and is a tremendous resource for information on ADL's policies and suggestions related to terrorism, related to hate crimes, related to a wide array of things in the civil rights arena. And I urge everybody here to come up to him afterwards and utilize his resources and our resources, the resources of the Anti-Defamation League. So, back to extremism. 2 years ago, I published a report with ADL Center on Extremism, in which I actually examined domestic terrorism from the extreme right in the United States. I took a 25-year time span, so roughly 1992 through 2017, and I found 150 terrorist incidents coming from extreme right movements within the United States. Now, by terrorist incidents, I include terrorist attacks, attempted attacks, attacks that failed or were thwarted by law enforcement, and plots, which were essentially attacks thwarted by law enforcement in the planning stages. 150 incidents. 255 people were killed in these 150 incidents. More than 600 were injured. And if I were to add the totals of the past 2 years, the totals, including attacks like those in Pittsburgh or El Paso, the number would be higher still. And so this is actually a real problem. Now, we have to be realistic. This is not a problem like the problem of gun violence in general in the United States, where thousands of people are killed every year. But it is a serious problem, especially because hate crimes and terrorism can have an impact far beyond the primary or secondary victims. They can affect entire communities. They can cause fear and terror in an entire nation. Moreover, extremist violence is hardly limited to terrorist attacks. That may be true for like an international terrorist organization trying to conduct an attack here in the United States, where they might have to get to the United States, and their whole purpose, like with the 9/11 hijackers, would be to conduct that attack. But domestic extremists are always already here, and they're always causing problems. Just to give you an example, over the past 10 years, so 2009 through the end of 2018, we've documented at least 427 murders committed by domestic extremists of all types. That's domestic Islamist extremists, left-wing extremists, and right-wing extremists. Of those 427 murders, slightly over 73% were committed by right-wing extremists, compared to about 3% by left-wing extremists and around 24% by domestic Islamist extremists. Last year, in 2018, we documented 50 people killed in the United States by extremists. 49 of those 50 were killed by one form or another of right-wing extremists. Now, those were not all acts of terrorism. That also includes hate crimes that did not rise to the level of terrorism. It included spontaneous violence against police officers and like a traffic stop involving an anti-government extremist. And involved other types of murders as well. But a death is a death is a death. And so you can see just by these numbers that the problem of right-wing extremism is something that we need to take seriously, just as the threat of domestic Islamist violence is also one that needs to be taken seriously. I don't view this as a zero-sum game. I don't view this as a horse race. We are a country with 320 million people. Even the fringe of the fringe is a lot of folks, and at any given time we face threats from a number of quarters, from a number of different types of extremism and fringe beliefs and movements. And we can't ignore any of those without it coming back to haunt us. So deal specifically with the threat of right-wing extremism, we need to understand the nature of right-wing extremism. And too many people in this country, from the media to the government to law enforcement, have an insufficient understanding of this threat. In particular, all too often, right-wing extremism is equated with white supremacy. In part, this is understandable. White supremacists are very visible. They're very violent. Of the killings by right-wing extremists over the past 10 years that I mentioned, white supremacists were responsible for 76% of those murders. So they are quite deadly. But that still leaves a quarter of the deaths committed by other types of right-wing extremists. And many of them engage in other types of crimes that white supremacists don't engage in at all. So anti-government extremists like sovereign citizens, for example, engage in a wide variety of paper terrorism tactics. These are sort of harassment and retaliatory tactics aimed at government officials, law enforcement, businesses, private citizens. They also engage in scams and frauds that can range into the millions, tens of millions, or in a couple cases, even hundreds of millions of dollars. And so there's this huge panoply of problems that they can cause. Moreover, even if we just look at terrorist incidents, we see a considerable amount of variety. Of the 150 terrorist incidents that I alluded to, white supremacists were responsible for only 43% of them. Anti-government extremists, by which I mean militia, tax protesters, and sovereign citizens, were responsible for virtually the same amount, 42%. And a variety of other right-wing extremist movements made up the remaining 15%. And so we need to pay attention to white supremacists, but if we concentrate only on white supremacists, thinking that that's the extreme right, then we might come to regret it, as all of the 16 movements that I list in my paper have some association, to some degree, with violent acts, and up to and including murders. So my paper then lays out the entire far right in the United States as it currently stands. It emphasizes 16 different movements within it. Some are white supremacist in nature. Even white supremacists themselves are by no means monolithic. They're all white, but that's about, once you get beyond that, there's a lot of differences. Differences in history, differences in subcultures, differences in focus and tactics. Some of these 16 movements are anti-government in nature, and others are single-issue movements. And this landscape, too, is always changing. Some of these movements have roots going back many decades. Others are only a few years old. And so this is not a static phenomenon either. So let's start with white supremacy. White supremacy is not a single movement. You can think of it more as an umbrella movement that has no fewer than 7 different major sub-movements or subcultures within it. These, as I already mentioned, these movements are different in different ways, with different histories, different subcultures, different types of groups, different things that they hate more than others. But they all share the key tenet of modern white supremacy, which is that the white race itself is in imminent danger of extinction. Some refer to it as white genocide, by a rising population of non-whites who are controlled and manipulated by Jews. And modern white supremacists of whatever movement believe that any action, even extreme violence, is justified if it will, quote-unquote, save the white race. What are these different movements within white supremacy? The oldest are traditional white supremacists that date all the way back to the original Ku Klux Klan of the 1860s and 70s. These are groups and individuals that arose primarily from opposition to equal rights for blacks. And that's why we call them traditional white supremacists. They consist mostly of Ku Klux Klan and neo-Confederate groups. There are a few other groups like the Council of Conservative Citizens that are among them. The good thing is that they have been in a long-term decline ever since the end of the Civil Rights era. The bad thing is they haven't winked out of existence yet. They're still here. And as a result, they still cause problems. Joining traditional white supremacists starting in the 1950s and being a continuous presence thereafter are neo-Nazis. We actually had original Nazis in the United States, in places like New Jersey and New York and Ohio, but World War II kind of put an end to them, but they came back in overtime, you might say, and arose in the 1950s. We've had a neo-Nazi problem ever since, a significant source of violence, a significant and consistent source of the ideology that suffuses much of the white supremacist movement in general. By the 50s and 60s, we also started to see two specifically religious forms of white supremacy, two religious sects or fringe religious movements that were based on foundations of white supremacy. The first is one called Christian identity, which has its roots, earliest roots, all the way back in the late 19th century. But at its heart, Christian identity believers believe that white people are descended from the ancient Israelites of the Bible. The Bible is a message written only for white people, and that blacks and Jews were not created when white people were created, but were created in the case of blacks when God created the beasts of the fields, and in the case of Jews, they were the product of a liaison between Eve and the serpent. And so you can see all of their religious beliefs are sort of founded on a cornerstone of racism and anti-Semitism. Around the same time arose a form of modern Norse paganism that also had white supremacist foundations. Modern Norse paganism is a revival of ancient Norse myths and practices, and it's part of the larger neo-pagan revival in the United States of the past half century. And most modern Norse pagans are not racist or white supremacist, but a subset of them are. And white supremacist Norse pagans, they often call themselves Odinists or Wotenists, have been a consistent and growing presence over the past several decades, and in particular, they're popular among white supremacists who have spent time in prison. In the 1980s, racist skinheads joined this palette. Racist skinheads were a subculture that started in Great Britain as early as the late 60s and early 70s, and again was not actually originally racist, but a racist variant of the skinhead subculture developed in Great Britain and made its way to the United States in the 1980s and really exploded in popularity in the late 1980s and early 1990s, bringing a rush of newly radicalized young white males into the white supremacist movement. Something very similar to the rise of the alt-right in the past few years. Also really growing starting in the 1980s were white supremacist prison gangs. These are white supremacist gangs that we call them prison gangs because most of them have arisen in prisons, but now most of them are just as active on the streets as they are behind bars. And while they tend to have a white supremacy that is cruder and often less deeply held than the other segments of the white supremacist movement, they make up for it in terms of their size. These are the largest white supremacist groups in the country. The largest range from 1,500 to 2,000 members in size, compared to an average Klan group that might have 20 people in it, for example. And they are also extremely violent. Now, luckily, a lot of the people that they kill are their own members, whom they suspect as informants or kill for breaking rules, but nevertheless, they're deadly. And moreover, they also engage in hate crimes and other sort of more ideological crimes from time to time. And then finally, we have the alt-right, which is the new kid on the block, with origins starting really around 2012, 2013, but really being energized and growing from 2015 onward because of its peculiar and unusual relationship to the 2015 presidential campaign, which caused alt-right adherents to become much more energetic and much more active, which attracted media attention to them, which brought them new recruits, which then became more active, and this sort of strange cycle was created. And the alt-right was, again, brought in a large number of newly radicalized young white males into the white supremacist movement. The first big influx of new recruits to the white supremacist movement since the last burst in the late 80s and early 90s with racist skinheads. And so it's had a significant effect. These are people who are full of the ideology, full of hate, eager to do something, have not learned any of the lessons of the past because they weren't there in the past. And it's not a coincidence that we've seen their impact in places ranging from Charlottesville to Poway, California to El Paso. So just white supremacy alone is a pretty complex environment. Anti-government extremism, often collectively referred to as the Patriot Movement, also contains multiple movements. The anti-government extremists were for a long time a relatively small part of the far right, but the collapse of the communist bloc and the end of the Cold War created a lot of fresh room, just like the collapse of the dinosaurs made room for mammals. It allowed many people on the far right to replace anti-communist conspiracy theories with conspiracy theories about their own government. The tax protesters are the most mild version of the segment of the Patriot movement, focus on a belief that income tax laws are illegitimate and a conspiracy is hiding this. The sovereign citizen movement is much more complex, that people believe the entire government has been subsumed by a conspiracy and they owe no allegiance to it. And the militia movement believes in a New World Order conspiracy theory and believes that our government is collaborating with the New World Order. There are, in addition, a number of single-issue right-wing extremist movements. Single-issue movements are often, not always, but often the extreme wing of a much more mainstream movement. So, for example, just as there are many environmentalists in this country, there are very few in the extreme wing who might be willing to commit violence in the name of environmentalism. Similarly, with anti-abortion extremism, the largest of the single-issue movements, there are many people in this country who believe that abortion is immoral and should be made illegal. There are only a few people so extreme that they're willing to kill or to burn down abortion clinics in order to stop abortions. And anti-abortion extremism, which is much smaller than either white supremacy or anti-government extremism, is nevertheless responsible for 11% of the terrorist-related plots over the past 25 years. And so they have a disproportionate impact compared to their small size. Other right-wing single-issue movements include anti-public lands extremists. This is primarily in the western states where you have people opposed to the federal stewardship of the public lands. And this is mostly mainstream, but there is a small extreme wing to this, and we saw an example of that in January 2016 when anti-public lands extremists combined with some people from the militia movement took over the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in Oregon and held that for a month. Other single-issue extremists include anti-immigration extremists and anti-Muslim extremists, both of which have gotten quite a boost in the past several years. And then lastly, I want to mention an emerging new movement. You can call it a single-issue movement. You could also call it a subculture. It's sort of a mix, and these are incels. This is a slang word that's short for involuntary celibates. This is a subculture of toxic masculinity that has developed over the past several years in which generally young males, not always white males, who are unable to form meaningful relationships with women, channel this into anger and extreme misogyny. And this has actually resulted in, over the past 5 years, several violent shooting sprees, including one in California and one in Tallahassee. And we're quite concerned that we could see more violence coming out of the incel subculture going forward. And so you can see that this is a real mix. And some of these movements like each other. Some of these movements have nothing to do with each other. Some have sort of loose alliances. But they're often very different. And this affects us in a lot of ways in terms of what we write about the extreme right, in terms of how law enforcement deals with the extreme right. If you're law enforcement being sent to do undercover work in an anti-government extremist group, cannot go assuming that these people are white supremacists. I mean, the sovereign citizen movement, for example, is it's the only far-right movement that has a substantial number of people of color in it. But it does have thousands and thousands of people of color in it. The vast majority of sovereign citizens in this metro area are probably African Americans. And so, which is ironic because many of the pioneers of that ideology were themselves white supremacists, but it just shows you the strange evolution